Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. We are very excited and a bit nervous too. Let me introduce myself. I'm Maritza Fariña, originally from Chile. I work at Allison for the last 23, 24 years. I am a Spanish instructor. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Yeah, I am work at Allison in the mother language department, and originally I am from Chile.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hala. I'm originally from Lebanon. I'm a graduate of Mount Allison, and I have a master's in international development and a master's in public administration, and I'm in Halifax at the moment.
Hi, I'm Noah. I'm a fourth year political science Mount Allison major, and I'm right now coming from Vancouver. Yeah, thank you for having us.
Hi, my name is Kiara. I'm a fourth year psychology student here at Mount Allison University. I'm currently in Sackville, but I'm originally from Hartland, New Brunswick, and I'm an Indigenous student of the Mi'kmaq tribe.
Hello everyone, my name is Okello, and I'm originally from Uganda but currently based in Moncton, and I work at Mount Allison University as the Black Student Advisor and Diversity Educator. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, let's start. I'm going to introduce you to this panel with something that it's could be for so many people a detail, but it's so important for us as people that come from another cultures and arrive to Canada, or we are being born here, but also we are from a not a white background. And I'm going to talk to you about the names, our names. When I arrived to Canada almost 33 years ago, when I landed in Pearson Airport, the person from immigration gave us the welcoming and asked me my name. And I said, my name is Maritza Fariña. And then she immediately interrupted me and said, no, you are not anymore Fariña. You are Maritza Martínez in this country. You can imagine that coming for the very, very first couple of minutes into Canada, I didn't say a word because I was afraid that they can put me back and I couldn't go back to my country at that moment. Just to show you that we cannot change the names of the people. As the professors or as the students, we cannot change the names. The names of our names is part of our identity. And we have to make, and this is for the prof most of it, we have to make an extra effort to keep the names of the students as they want it. There are students that obviously like better another name, and we have to accept that. But we cannot change the name of our students. That is the first step to a racist attitude, a colonialist attitude.
Sorry. Yeah. I want to talk just a little bit about something that happened in our department years and years ago. Yeah, at one point we were discussing to create the European studies in our department, but not only our department, is other department to work together. Yeah. And in that discussion, one day I talked to a prof from the classic department, Ivan Cohen, yeah, and I said, "Oh, Ivan, this is what our idea. What do you think about it?" Yeah, and Ivan Cohen said something to me that at the beginning, I didn't really understand, and said, Juan Carlos, why we are going to teach European studies? That is what we have done already for 300 years. Why we are going to put European studies? At the beginning, I was not clear that, but after I start to talk and reflect on that, years and years after, more than 10 years, I start to read something from the Puerto Rican sociologist Ramon Fogel. And Ramon Fogel put together that 300 years of European teaching. But I need to start with Boaventura de Sousa Santos, that he said that the problem that we have now in our society and in the education system is a epistemicide. That means the extermination of knowledge and way of knowing. Principally that is a knowledge that is completely out of the way that we think. But Ramon Grossfogel started with a question, and that is the question that we need to think. How it is possible that canon of thought in all the disciplines in the westernized university is based on the knowledge produced for a few men from 5 countries in Western Europe: Italy, France, England, Germany, and United States. And that is, I think, is a problem when we talk about racism, classism, or sexism. Why? Because the problem that I think in the way that we teach is the knowledge of these men, because women are completely out, explain the historical and social realities of the rest of the world. That means that countries, that is less than the 10% of the population of the world, impose one way of thinking that is they call universality, is for everyone. The way that these men from 5 countries think was imposed. Why they impose, for example, capitalism, patriarchism, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modernity, colonial world system. And that is what we continue to teach to our students. If we know that the one knowledge is considered superior, universal, and the knowledge coming from the global south, are considered inferior and not part of the canon of the thought. The majority of the world, like when we said the millionaires are at the 1% and the 99% of us is not millionaire, is a small idea of how the world needs to work, is imposed. Now, the structure that we have of how we develop knowledge in universities are, as a result, and until today, epistemically racist, sexist, and classist. What happened is that the rest of the world, the knowledge of the world, is kidnapped. Kidnapped. For example, the Europeans, the whites, way of thinking, kidnap and monopolize, for example, the definition of democracy. the definition of human right, the definition of economic, the definition of woman liberation. And that is the reason that I think that our problem is that we continue teaching in that way. We can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about classism, but if we don't talk that the system is the problem, we are not going to change anything. We need to talk about capitalism, and we need to talk about neoliberalism as the problem. Yeah, I want to finish with, for example, María Galindo, that is a feminist from Bolivia, de Mujeres Creando. Yeah, she said that at one point, yeah, one of the things that she said about what's going on is they said, why we are, look what is going on. We have a cake. Yeah, everyone wants a piece of the cake. And a lot of women, she said, yeah, want a piece of the cake that are going to give me some right to me. And she said, that is not the problem. The cake is rotten. The cake is the problem. We don't need a piece of the cake. We need to create a new cake. Or, in other way, she said, like in a frame, if you put a frame, she said, doesn't matter how many women are inside of this frame. The frame is to there not to give us the right. And I think that is the problem. Our system, the system that we have of education, don't allow to bring something new. It's not that I am not talking that leave everything from the Western European out. No. It's to have respect for other knowledge and bring other knowledge to the table. And that is the reason why we need to end it with racism, sexism, and classism. Okay, that's it.
So when I was asked to be on this panel, they asked me to reflect on some experience that I had and what I had observed in the classroom. And a lot of stories came to my mind, but something that happened to a friend of mine actually is what I'm going to talk about today. So 3 or 4 years ago, my friend Ashley enrolled in a course about Cuba. It was called the Cuban Revolution and Development Model. She was very excited about taking this course because it involved attending a total of 5 lectures in Canada and then spending a little bit less than 2 weeks in Cuba, experiencing the culture and doing some on-site learning. The day would start with them sitting through a couple of lectures given by Cuban professors. The lectures were, of course, translated into English. And then they would be transported via private shuttles to go visit a historical site or a place that was connected to the lecture in some way, where they would get another overview of events that took place there. They would then return to their hotel, where they would get the late afternoon and evening off. And now, because of safety issues, they were only allowed to go to certain places, and for most evenings, the university had prepared certain activities for them to do. They had organized beach days, visits to the markets, and nights out to Havana's top jazz clubs and restaurants. When I asked my friend if she had talked to any Cubans, other than the professors who lectured, she said to me that she had chatted with a couple of people at the market. They asked where she was from and what she was doing in Havana, and they had had a brief conversation, 5 or 10 minutes maybe. Now, of course, they had to do assignments and papers, but Ashley came back tanned and relaxed, having spent a great 11 days in Cuba. Now, the goals of these education abroad programs that are very widespread in universities is to give an opportunity for students to experience values, beliefs, and ways of life that are different from theirs, to become aware firsthand rather than just conceptually that people do things differently in different places. It's supposed to help students become global citizens and help them understand that they are not the center of the universe, that they have a responsibility to the rest of the world, and that because they come from a privileged country, their actions have consequences, and their country's policies and their way of life have consequences beyond their immediate circle. Going abroad is supposed to show students how they are not an island and how everything is connected. It's supposed to dismantle these power relations that were established by colonialism and imperialism. But I don't think any of this happened for Ashley. What I described before is a tourist visit to Havana that maintains the colonial power relations between the students and their hosts. I'm not arguing that tourism is a colonial endeavor in itself and then the way tourists interact with the country they're visiting should be completely changed. That's an argument that some people make, and I'm not sure to what extent I agree with it, but that's a debate for a different time. I'm also going to put aside the fact that this 11-day trip cost my friend $4,000. Which means only a certain segment of the population, and by that I mean those who can afford it, typically white upper-class students, will be able to go, and all the rest of the students are excluded. I'm going to put that aside. I understand that the system being the way it is, people have to pay for things like this, but we're not going to talk about that for now. What I am saying, though, is that this was supposed to be an educational experience that gives the students engaging with it something to reflect on. Instead, it was one that I call colonial because it put the students at the center of the trip and transported their expectations and their Canadian way of life to Cuba. I'm pretty sure people in Cuba don't live in a hotel with a pool, cable TV, air conditioning, and access to unlimited amount of fruits and buffets. They don't take private shuttles to travel from place to place, and Cuban students don't have one lecture a day and the rest of the day free to roam around the city. The way the course was structured and the amenities it provided gave students who participated an out. Their hotel gave them an out, a place for them to retreat, to take a break from being in Cuba until they felt like rejoining that world. Ashley told me that the students had amazing discussions about the Cuban Revolution and what it must have been like to be there. They tried to put themselves in the Cubans' shoes and thought about how people would react in Canada if similar circumstances existed here. But as soon as they were out of the lecture hall, that conversation ended and tourist mode was on. Even the restaurants they went to were catered to their Canadian palate and hosted primarily non-Cubans on vacation. Despite being in Cuba, the island and its inhabitants were the other. Cubans were almost completely excluded from the experience. Even the lectures Ashley attended were offered exclusively to her and her cohort, with no input or perspectives offered from their Cuban counterparts. This can be so easily compared to the colonial way of doing things, transporting your culture, your way of doing things to a foreign place and excluding the way of life of the locals. When I asked her whether her learning would have been greatly affected or changed if she had done it in the classroom here in Canada, she said, "To be honest with you, I don't think the outcome would have changed that much. It was nice to be on the ground and see the places we were studying in real life, but it wasn't what I expected, and I did not gain as much perspective as I thought I would. What I got was 11 fun days in Cuba." Of course, it might be hard to remove these colonialist tendencies completely from study abroad program. And this program is interesting because it was only 11 days, so it's even harder to remove these tendencies. There are logistical obstacles like the safety of the students and time management, But our responsibility is to ensure that these colonialist tendencies are recognized, and working on reducing them might be the way forward. For example, not using a private shuttle to go from place to place, even if it might take a long time. Going to local restaurants, not staying in a 5-star hotel, interacting with the locals and involving them in intellectual conversations more by maybe staying with host families or pairing Canadian students with Cuban students at the university where the lectures are taking place. Moreover, it is important to introduce post-colonial scholarship into these programs. By that, I mean making sure students reflect on what their role is and how they are complicit in maintaining global power relations, making them consider their responsibility to those who are disadvantaged through no fault of their own, comparing, for example, for this program specifically, Canada and Cuba's colonial past, exploring how Canada-Cuban relations, for example, from both the Canadian and the Cuban perspective. So there are a lot of ways to make this program better. Study abroad programs exist in all of our universities, and much like we have to ensure that our classrooms are not colonial, we have a responsibility to ensure that these programs do what they were meant to do when they were first created. We have to ensure that they are not reinforcing colonial power relations, but that they are dismantling them. So thank you for your attention.
Hi. I want to speak briefly about transgression in the classroom and safe spaces, specifically in the position of minority students who are either unrepresented or misrepresented by their school's faculty, curriculums, or administrations. So to begin, as a Black student, as a Black academic in Mount A's classroom, it's opposed safe spaces, wherein the average student comes from a household that earns double my own and is at the same time ignorant that the institution they attend benefited directly from the transatlantic slave trade. I am uncomfortable. Viscerally so. To utter such things in the classroom is to transgress due to the simple fact that the university has made a fortune on the backs of Black slaves and subsequently Black students, all without teaching a single class on Black history in Sackville. In the face of silence, transgression is necessary. That is to say, specifically, that considering the present neocolonial tint of educational norms, students must enter the classroom prepared to both call out the system of oppression and system of destroyed knowledge and reframing of history that Juan Carlos just spoke, Dr. Martínez just spoke about. But at the same time, students need to be prepared to speak on that, and faculty need to be prepared to allow for that conversation to happen. And by that, I mean, the classroom is a top-down space. A professor enters, they speak, students take notes, they speak back, so on and so forth. But knowledge is stored in the book, knowledge is stored in the PhD. And professors have to be prepared to share the power of the PhD because it is theoretically reinforced while experience might be lacking. For example, while in sociology classes last semester, I will omit professor names and class names. I was in a class pertaining to refugees, and the first paper we had in that class was a paper about Central African refugees in Uganda, written by a man from a Scandinavian university with the Scandinavian surname, and at no point did the paper mention tribal designation, language, region, so on and so forth. In a way that reading the paper, if one had spoken or known anything about either Uganda, the continent of Africa, so on and so forth, one could see this person, this academic, has one, spread misinformation in some way because they have failed to nuance their study, and on top of that, have now misrepresented people's countries' languages. And my position in that class at that point, after recognizing that, was to call such thing out. However, in a classroom, to call out the validity of a source as a student, a source picked by the PhD, is a transgression. And I think that in some way, dialogue about the validity of sources, the validity of information, so information from a power source or an institution that lacks eyes on the ground or felt experience, is theory at best and useless at worst. And by that I mean, for me to sit in a classroom with refugee parents while I'm learning about refugees from a white professor that has never spoken to a refugee before is quite nonsensical. And on top of that, for me to then believe that I should not transgress in that classroom is not only counter to the safe space, because I have to be silenced for the comfortability of others, but now if I do choose to speak, my apparent understanding of the topic silences others because of their ignorance. And I think it creates this segregated classroom wherein white students are looking at a person of color, a minority student, as if they've broken a code, they've shattered some norm, and the professor now has to mediate this as it's happening, and the black student continues to transgress. All because at the end of the day, the intellectual hegemony of the classroom, of the educational system itself, has not been contested. And at the same time, professors, white students, so on and so forth, are so used to their norms, are so used to the fact that they should enter a classroom and see 20 other white people, that they should open a book and it be in their first language, that they should so on and so forth and so on and so forth. Once a transgression against that system happens, there is an immediate reaction being discomfort, an immediate reaction being a hand up, an immediate reaction being a professor telling a person of color that they are stopping dialogue, even though they are adding to it. And I think that if we fail to continue to really look at this issue, look at what transgression looks like in positions of power and in positions of in hierarchical institutions, how transgression looks will greatly impact the decolonization of safe spaces. Whether indigenous students, whether female students, whether black students feel safe enough to transgress will be very indicative on the future movements that they bring to the table, will be very influential on the crafting of future student leaders. And I think that professors need to be prepared to cultivate such ideas and such mindsets. I leave with the quote: "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy," Bell Hooks, and I think that's still true. I think it has to be true given the goals of the academy and the hopes of the academy, which are in some way to craft the thinkers of the future. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So for my portion of this, I'm going to be speaking on personal experiences as an Indigenous student, where I have found that the institution is so rooted in comfort. It likes to keep its comfortable colonial qualities. So when it's confronted with Indigenous perspectives, it's very hard to budge. Throughout my university career and through talking with peers from other universities, it is always an uphill battle to try to broaden the perspective at universities, just because they are so comfortable in their colonial structures that they would rather keep that and disadvantage non-white, non-settler students than deconstruct those institutions and rebuild something that is good for everyone. And a personal little anecdote that I've heard from another university that I think really highlights this is that of an Indigenous mother that was in a social work program that was directly designed to draw on Indigenous and First Nations experiences. It was supposed to be this holistic and culturally relevant approach to social work. So this young mother had a newborn, and it was too young to be put in daycare, and she was in this city and didn't have any other option but to bring her child to class. And in Indigenous communities, everyone is involved in the raising of a child. It's not just the parents. It's not even just the parents and the grandparents. It's your aunts, it's your uncles, it's your cousins, it's family, and just the whole community in general. And in our communities, we really support having the mother close with the child, because that's the best way that they are nurtured and grow and learn. So she had no other option but to bring her child to class, and she was met with complaints. Sorry about that. It's raining and there's lots of traffic right outside my apartment. I apologize for that. But instead of being met with understanding and trying to work with her to ensure that both her and her child got the best experience within that program, she was met with complaints and threatened to be excused from the program entirely if she did not leave her child at home or at a daycare, which was not even an option. And there were other mothers that have gone through that program that had the same issue. And the university did not want to comply. They said, absolutely not. Nope, no way are we going to change these rules. No way are we going to try to accommodate and work with you. The Indigenous community in that region even offered to have a talking circle with elders and with other people in the community to try to find a solution to this issue, and the university simply refused. They said, nope, we are sticking with our decision. Either the kid stays home or this mother will be excused from our program. And, you know, what do you do in that situation? Do you choose your family, your own child, or do you choose your education? That should never be a choice that anyone has to make. And especially with Indigenous people where we're already disadvantaged with, you know, could this mother even afford childcare? Is it accessible to her? Is it culturally relevant to whatever her tribe may be? You know, there's just all these things stacked against her, and the university just refused to budge. They wanted to stay comfortable in their little colonial structure, and that was that. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. So I think that's just one example where the well-being and the culture of Indigenous students is put on the back burner in order to preserve colonial institutions. There are countless stories at my university and then at many other universities where this tends to be the case. So I guess the biggest takeaway is that in order to see any real change, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And, you know, go outside what we have constructed as the status quo, which is just colonial white perspectives. You know, I speak with people who are kind of higher up and are like, oh yes, we're totally for decolonization and reconciliation, you know, they're totally on board because it sounds nice. But when it comes to it, it's hard, it's uncomfortable. It's not a fun process to go through when you are so used to the current state of things. But in order to see any real change, I think we have to be ready to just be uncomfortable. But yeah, that's my bit.
Thanks, Kiara. So I think tying down to really, you know, what our main sort of discussion has been on anti-racism in academic and community spaces. I think up to this point, the main emphasis has really been on just the colonial nature of the structure of university as it stands, but also on just the daily sort of cultures or practices within our institutions. But I think I really want us to shift our focus to what anti-racism looks like in our campuses at this point in time. Because I think, as our previous speakers have mentioned, we continue to wrestle with the issues of the colonial nature of our practices, or the structures and the systems and how they function, and how in the end they do not deliver the same level of returns that we desire for our underrepresented students. And I think I would like to add to this conversation in really creating an environment where we can reflect on how we practice within our institutions and how we practice within our day-to work and in our day-to-day work. And I want to begin by emphasizing that anti-racism, is more than just equity and diversity and inclusion. And I think while most universities have selectively embraced EDI, the main emphasis has always been from the beginning and should have been and should continue to be on anti-racism education in general. Because I think at the very fabric of how our institutions are founded is to deliver a return which is education. And I think anti-racism education should be part of that education. But I also like to help to provide a little bit of a context on anti-racism education is really its origins. And from what I could find was that anti-racism work really goes back to the civil rights movements and how that sort of created policy in the 60s through the Civil Rights Act, for example, in the United States, which became like the backdrop within which policy, and in this case, government policy, would be put together to enable institutions approach underrepresented communities and try and bridge the gaps that existed among underrepresented communities. But the thing with that too was all really a shift from that time, from anti-racism policy being a government sort of approach to one whereby it turned later on to become a business attribute, whereby diversity, equity, and inclusion was sold as a business sort of aspect that would be useful in the marketplace to include other communities. And I think it's there that we've seen increasing representation from underrepresented communities within our university settings or the marketplace. And also with that also came the current sort of present view that looks at equity as fairness. And in the end, the intention with that is to really emphasize on equal outcomes. And I think the intention, as I always share with students, is that whenever we have a new group of students going on to university in September, the intention should be to have the same number of students graduate during at the end of 4 years. But most times, and this is really where anti-racism work should be the focus, because we have students falling through the cracks because of the accessibility challenges that they might have on campus, or because of the needs that they might not be supported, or also just the difficulty in transition that many of our students experience. So with that, I would really like us to think of anti-racism as an act of taking bold actions against ideas, systems, practices, and norms and individual behaviors within our universities. And I think the important part is to really reflect on the history of our ideas, the history of the ideas of our founders, or the practices that we undertake within our universities and norms, and to really reflect that if we are to create anti-racist spaces within our campuses, what will that take? And it takes challenging systems, it takes challenging ideas, it takes challenging racist individuals, and I think that comes with a level of responsibility that each one of us should take, but also more importantly, it comes with a level of preparation. And I hope that by the time I am done with this session, I will have provided you with some meaningful opportunities to be able to react. So I think individually, one of the things that I would like to propose is to enable people to respond to or to avert racist incidents, is to practice safety. And I think something that is severely lacking in our campuses is the feeling of safety among underrepresented students. And by safety, I mean the opportunity to exist, and to exist without anticipating harm or expecting harm from other groups. And I think to create that means we have to go beyond our expectations within the classrooms, to say if you have one underrepresented student who identifies as Black or Indigenous or second gen, how do you enable that student to feel safe in a classroom which is predominantly white? And I think this is something that faculty and staff at universities should actively reflect on, because I think the reality is that through the attempts to diversify our campuses, we're having increasing number of students from different communities. And I think it's our responsibility to enable them feel safe and to enable them feel that they can attain the best outcomes that they can aspire to within their university experience. But now when it comes to responding to like racist incidences, this, due to the nature of just how complex and unexpected that they can be, this is really becomes very, very, a nerve-wracking exercise, because most times to mitigate acts of racism, you have to be prepared to anticipate the level of need and also to assess the safety of yourself, but also the people that are involved. And most times I do recognize the risk that comes with being able to intervene in the event of a racist incident. I think, and really centering on, university settings, how can we reflect more on how we can react to incidents of racism? And I think, as I mentioned earlier on, the first incident is to really think about safety. And most of our students need to feel safe. And I think it helps to reflect on that in terms of thinking about how do racialized students feel within our campuses and how do they feel within our classrooms. And again, is it safe to call out a racist incident? For instance, if you're a bystander and you witnessed it, is it safe to defend the victim in the event of an incident of that kind when you're able to respond to it? And again, I always suggest that if your responses are yes, then this is really the opportunity that you can do to step in and use your power and call out the racist ideas that are being practiced in a typical kind of situation. Because as Dr. Ibram Kendi cites, is that the only way we can undo racism is to constantly identify it, describe it, and dismantle it. And I think it's something that I would want to leave each and every one of you today, that to identify and to challenge racism means we have to constantly identify it, describe it, and dismantle it. And this means sometimes being reflexive to say, what are your individual ideas towards specific communities? And you could be anti-racist now during this session and be racist an hour later. And I think to know that the behavior being so ingrained in our lifestyles and in our ideas and in the way we've grown up within colonial systems that continue to influence us up to this day, that we are, we are vulnerable to being racist. And to do that means a constant reflection on how our behavior either marginalizes folks from other underrepresented communities, or how our silence really contributes towards the existence of colonial systems and the practices of discrimination against those marginalized communities within our midst. So, and also the other thing I would recommend is that you reach out to a friend. And I think most times it helps during a racist incident to be able to ask the victim if there is a person they could speak to, because you might not have the confidence or the expertise to respond actively, to hear out the experiences of that person. So I think it's always a good idea to recommend them to a community that they feel safe, or to be able to propose if they know anyone of hand that could be able to intervene. But I think as a bystander, it would also help to be able to provide accurate information should the victim decide to report it. And I think thinking more on, incidences in the classroom whereby, a racial slur could be pronounced, or on residents, knowing that each and every single one of us has a responsibility to intervene as a bystander, either in supporting the victim or in calling out the attacker. And in this case, the silence really becomes problematic because it is complicity to racism and it is complicity to the colonial practices that mean that we continue to be uninvolved. And I think to be uninvolved in a colonial setting is one of complicity and does not really help us be anti-racist. But also I think it helps us to reflect on how we can create healing environments for targeted students. And I think, hearing from the speakers in our panel today, with Noah and Kiara and Hala, having studied in a traditionally white university where they have to build their own, like groups of community where they feel like they belong. I think having spaces for those gatherings is really helpful to enable students to succeed. And again, I think in the end, it helps also to take some of the students under your wings and give them the opportunity to really identify the potential that they have, whether as faculty or as staff. And this could be done, as mentorships, or as you really just providing the same opportunities to students to sort of carry on and be able to present their own potential in some kind of way. And I think the reason I present these sort of individual suggestions is because for the longest time we've always looked back to policy to say we need a policy and it's just going to be the magic bullet that fixes racism on our campuses. And as we know, that this has often been something that does not deliver the returns, because the due process of how policy works and also the frameworks within which it's supposed to be executed, which often require time, follow-up, that in the end, the victims of racist incidences do not come forward because they feel like rather than having to follow through, 3 weeks of meetings with an anti-racist group, they would rather, meet a community group, which means, they can feel a sense of community immediately after the incident, rather than having 3 weeks of face-to-face where they might actually have to recite the trauma in trying to explain to other members of, an anti-racist task force of how devastating it is. And I think, as we all know, like nobody likes to recite their own trauma because it's already damaging enough the first time it happens. So letting it and giving opportunities for someone to replay it is even more damaging and devastating for students. So I think, and that's why my emphasis really today is for us to reflect on individual actions that we can all do to create accessible spaces on our campuses and just how to be actively anti-racist. And I think it's something that everybody has a role. So, and I think, you can only be involved as an anti-racist or be racist, and referring, knowing how in the last few months we've had people aggressively denying being racist while at the very same time promoting racist ideas, which for me is almost surprising, thinking about the incident that happened with Jagmeet Singh not too long ago, and then one that had to do with a doctor in New Brunswick here, and just knowing the level and how far people can go to actually deny being racist, while at the same time condoning racist ideas, which for me is almost an acceptable level of hypocrisy at itself. So I think in the end, I would really like to leave you with these ideas, and I think I would want to really leave each one of you reflecting on what you can do with the power and the resources accessible to you to really reflect on what it means to create a safe anti-racist space in your classrooms, in your workspaces, in your residences, because I think the reality is that we all hold a certain level of power, whether it is colonial or not, and I think where we put it is really the difference, and we could put it towards being racist, or we could put it towards being anti-racist, and I think in this case, I would rather you put it towards being anti-racist. So, and another question would be, how can you respond to the nature of the institutional environment that you have, that you study in or you work in? And again, these are simple questions, but I think it helps each one of us reflect on our place, but also on our contribution in building safe and anti-racist spaces on our campus. And with that, really, that's all I had to say. And I think if anyone has a question, because I know we've had a number of speakers today, and I would be more than happy to respond if there's a question directed to me personally. But if not, I would leave it open to the rest of the floor for contributions.